Hey there, welcome to part 2 of the two-part series about TypeScript. In part 1, we learned all the basics of TypeScript. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I'm leaving the link up here and also in the description of this video. Make sure to watch part 1 so you can learn all the basics of TypeScript, and then you can come back here so we do this project. This is going to be a super simple beginner TypeScript project, and it is going to be a great example for you to get comfortable with TypeScript and apply all the basic fundamentals of TypeScript. This is going to be based on a student array that has kind of a weird shape, and you will see how TypeScript can help us tremendously in these kinds of situations. So we deal with this array the correct way and write good code, valid code from the beginning. TypeScript will help us avoid many mistakes and will dramatically increase our productivity when working with this project. So I hope you are ready because this project can't wait. Let's write some TypeScript code now. Hey there, in this video we are going to start a project that will allow us to practice everything we learned so far about TypeScript. This is going to be super simple. It is a student's database and we need to generate this table. I was going to add more features to this project like filters and an input field so we can add students, but I decided to leave these things out because I don't want to overcomplicate this. I want us to fully focus on the TypeScript part. So this is going to be just about getting the students from a JSON and then generating this table. And by using TypeScript, we're going to identify a lot of potential errors. So if we open the inspector, let's go to the console, we can see that we're going to get the students from this array, but we're going to have some challenges here because some properties will be present for some students, but not for others. The shapes of some properties might be a bit different depending on the student. We also need to do calculations, like for the birth year, we need to calculate the age, but the birth year is in string. So I left a lot of things like this on purpose, just so we learn how to use TypeScript to help us write good code from the beginning. You can download the initial version for this project. So I'm going to open the TS Students Initial, and we need to run this in the browser. So we are going to use the live server from Visual Studio Code. I already have it, so I have this Go Live button. If you don't have this button, you can just go to the extension section and you search for live server. Then you can download this extension. Once you have it installed, maybe you have to close and open Visual Studio Code again, you will see this Go Live button. So when we click Go Live, we will see the project in the web browser. So I'm going to close the final version and we can start working on the project. So here we only have an example. This is hard-coded. This is not done using TypeScript yet. Let's go to Visual Studio Code so we can check these things. So as you can see in the TS file, we have some code, but this is just so we don't waste time on the HTML part. This is just a function I made so we can add a new student to the table. But as you can see, everything here is hard-coded. We are not getting this from the array of students yet. So that array is going to come from a JSON that I left in another file. This is in the data.ts file. And the reason why I did this is to simulate getting the student's data from an external source, like an API. So this is what we have. This is just the basic HTML part. We are going to work on all the TypeScript part together from the beginning. We also have this HTML file, which has a table. As you can see, the T-body is empty. So everything we generate in the table will be done from the TypeScript code. So let's go back to the index file and we are now ready to start this project. So let's go to the next video. Hey there, in this video we are going to start our first TypeScript project. we need to be able to output these students inside this HTML table. This is a super simple project, but it's going to be a good opportunity to get comfortable with TypeScript and to interacting with HTML elements. Now, before starting the work, every time you use TypeScript, you need to keep two important things in mind. The first one is that TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, meaning that it can be implemented gradually. I think this is important to remember because some people are not confident enough. They think they know too little about TypeScript, but remember that you can use it incrementally. So when you start your TS file, you can start writing plain JavaScript. And as you progress and learn more about TypeScript, you can start using more and more of its functionalities. The second thing is that TypeScript is here to help. TypeScript is not here to add extra work or to make us slower. And this means that we don't have to be worried about using it on every line of our code. We need to start using it in the places we know it can help us the most in making sure we write bug-free code. So having said that, let's go to Visual Studio Code and let's get started. So here we have this JSON with the information about the students, and we get this JSON from our code, and then we need to be able to print those students inside the table. We already have a function to add rows to the table, so we save time, but of course this is hard-coded, so this is the work that we need to do on this project. Now, thinking about what I said in the beginning of the video, how can we use TypeScript to help us write better code? Since we're gonna have to go inside this function and add a student to the table, it is important that we let TypeScript know that this is an HTML table element and that we are going to pass a student inside. And the student is going to be the most important part here because the shape for each student is not exactly the same. Some have a few properties, some don't. Some properties sometimes are arrays, sometimes are strings. So if we can clearly define a type that describes the shape of these students, then TypeScript will not allow us to make mistakes while we type our code. So let's get started by creating an interface for the students. So I'm going to use interface. We can call it student, and then we can define the shape of the object. Remember that you can also use type, but as we saw in previous videos, the interface has some extra features, so I prefer to use interface over type. So here we need to go to our data and try to describe to TypeScript what is the shape of a student. This is something that if you're working with external data, you should go to the documentation of the API to try to figure out what are the properties and in what data types they come, which of them are optional, so then you can more easily describe it in TypeScript. So in this case, let's start with the most obvious ones, which will be the ID, first name, and last name. These are all strings, and we can see that all students have these properties. So they are not optional. So let's go back there and let's start with the ID, which is a string, the first name, which is also a string, and the last name, which is a string as well. Now going back there, we also have the date of admission, and this is super important to define it as string because we are going to have to convert this into a date. So by letting TypeScript know that this is a string will help us prevent errors while we do this conversion. So let's copy this and let's see if all students have it. We can see that all of them do, so this is not optional as well. So we have date admission, which is a string. We also have the birth year. This one is also a string, and this is also super important because we are going to have to use it to calculate the age of the student. And again, by knowing that this is a string, this will help us prevent writing invalid code. So this is a string, and this is also present on all students. Now the next two will be a bit different. So going back there, we can see that for the focus area, this is an optional property. Some students don't have it, like this one. And for the students that have it, Some have it as an array, sometimes with 1, sometimes with 2 elements, but some of them have it as a string. For example, this one is receiving it as a string. So it is important that we describe this correctly, so TypeScript can help us handle all of these cases. So let's copy focus area. And here we are going to add a question mark to define this as optional. And the types that are possible here are either a string or, so we use a union type here with the bar, it can be an array of strings. So we type string, open and close braces. So either we don't have it at all, that's why the question mark, either you have it as string or an array of strings. So this will be enough to cover all possibilities for this property. Now going back there, we also have one called date registration suspended. This is a string and this is also optional. Just a few students have this one. Let's add it here as optional. So question mark, and this is going to be a string. So now we clearly define the shape of the student, and when we start typing code inside here, TypeScript will help us make sure we are writing valid code for all scenarios. Now, if you're worried that there might be some fields that are not showing here on this piece of the data, don't worry, because remember that we use TypeScript to help us during development. When we compile this file to JavaScript, this is not going to be there anyway. So this is here just to help us write good code for this function. If there is an extra property coming with students, this is going to be no problem at all. So now that we have this interface, we can go ahead and start changing this function. So the first thing here is to tell TypeScript that we are going to receive 2 arguments. To add a student to a row, we need to know which table we are adding the student to, and we also need to have the information about the student. Now let's define the type of these arguments. So the table is going to be the HTML table element. It is important that we are very specific about which element is it, because if we write some function that can't be applied on a table, TypeScript will let us know. So this is an HTML table element. Now the student is going to be of type student that we just defined up here. So now we are ready to work on this function, and this is what we are going to do in the next video. Hey there, now that we created the interface for the student, we can start working in the logic for this function. So remember that everything here is hard-coded. We need to prepare this function to receive a student and to add it as a row to this table. Before we do that, let's just check this error down here. So if we hover over it, it tells us that it expects 2 arguments but got 1. And this is because we just added the student. Since we are going to have to do a loop and run this for every student, I'm just going to comment this line for now. So going back here, we don't have to change anything regarding the HTML. This is why I left this done, so we don't waste time on this. All we have to do is replace these hard-coded values. So let's start with the name. Instead of hard-coding it, we are going to output the name of the student. So student.name. Wow, that was faster than expected. TypeScript already caught my first mistake. So this is something that could easily happen in a real-life situation. I got confused with the properties right here. And this is something that with JavaScript, we would have to see the error in the web browser, come back here and try to find where we made a mistake. But with TypeScript, we can see the error while typing. So let's remember that students don't have a name. They have first name and last name, so we are going to have to form the names ourselves. So I'm going to use the backticks to insert a template literal, and I'm going to use the first name. So this is going to be student.firstname. Then let's add a space, and then we can bring in the last name. So if we have no errors here, we can go ahead and start working on the age. Remember that we don't have to be going back and forth to the web browser, because if there is a mistake, we will know it. Of course, there are some things that TypeScript may not catch, but most of the errors will be raised. So let's go to the age. We're not going to hard code it, and we are going to have to make a calculation here, but remember that the birth year is in string. So we are going to have to be a bit careful. And after doing the calculation, we are going to get a number. And the problem here is that if we try to pass a number to the create text node, we are going to have an error. And why is that? This is because this method requires an argument that is a string. We can see the definition right here. So the name of the argument is data and the type is string. Even though JavaScript can handle these things, it's always good that we follow the correct types to avoid bugs. So here, anything we pass here is going to have to be converted into a string. So if we place this inside parentheses, we can then convert this to string by using the toString method. And by doing that, we don't have the error anymore. So we can have the calculation for the age right here, convert it to a string, and then we will be able to add this to this method, and then we will be able to pass it through this method without any problems. So right here, we can start calculating the age. For the age, we are going to need the current year, so we can get new date. And here we have an error being raised, and this is because this name does not exist. So this is another mistake I made. We need a space here because we need a new date object. There's no method called new date. We are creating a new date object, and we are going to get the full year. So this is the method we need. And now there is another mistake that TypeScript caught. You can see I forgot the parentheses for the method. So now we have the number for the full year, and we can subtract from student dot birth year. Now, of course, there will be an error raised right here because remember that the birth year is coming as a string. So if we hover over, we can see this being raised right here. So we need to convert this into a number. And since there won't be any decimal places, this is just the birth year, we can do parse int, and this is going to be converted into a number. So now we should have the correct date. We're going to get the year. We're going to subtract from the birth year. This will become the age of the student. We are going to convert it into a string and pass it through the node. Now, if you want to check if your code works, like I said, we don't have to be coming back and forth like we do with JavaScript because any possible errors will be raised while we type. But if you want to check how is this looking, you can come down here and let's maybe add a row. And remember that we need to pass a student. So what we can do here is just pass the first student so we see if this is working. So let's do student, and then let's pass the first student. Actually, students, which is the array of students, and then we pass the first one. Now we are having a problem in the select table because remember that we need this to be of type HTML table element. And this method that I created to select the table element, remember that when we select an element from HTML, TypeScript cannot make sure that this is a table. For TypeScript, this is just an element. So we need to do the type assertion right here. We can do it with the as keyword. So we are going to use the HTML table element because we know our page, we know for sure that that's the case. If we go to the HTML file, we can see that this element with the ID of students table is indeed a table. So it is safe to do this assertion. Now remember that the assertion can also be done with the angle brackets. So you can do it like this, but in this case, you need to add it before the value, like this. So now we don't have any problems. If we want to see this in the browser, there are two things that we need to do. Remember that we always need to compile the TypeScript file into JavaScript. So let's open the terminal. You can do this one time by typing TSC, but if you want to leave this watching for changes and compiling at every change, just use the -W to keep watching for changes, and every time you save something, it is going to compile again. Now, if you want to take a look at how the JavaScript file looks like, you can go here. You will see that the interface is not here. Like I said, that's only for development. We also don't have any type assertions here, so this is just to help us during development. So in the browser, since we are already running this with the live server, we can go straight to the browser and see what is going on. So we can see that the name is coming here correctly and the age is also correct. Now we need to work on the area of focus and registration status. And this is what we are going to do in the next video. I'll see you then. Hey there, now that we worked on the name and the age of the students, now it's time to build the logic for the area of focus. This is going to be a bit more complicated because remember, we can receive either a string or an array of strings, and also this is an optional property. So we need to make sure that our code will work on all these scenarios. We don't have anything to worry about because we know TypeScript is going to help us make sure that happens. So if you just want to erase these values for now, just so we see exactly which are the ones you already worked on, you can go back to Visual Studio Code and you can use an empty string here and here. So if we save this and go back there, we can clearly see that these are the ones we still need to work on. And by the way, I only saw the changes immediately because remember that I'm using the live server. So this is running in the web browser. And also I have the TypeScript compiler running in the watch mode. So if you want to see your changes appearing in the browser instantly, you need to run TSC-W. So let's get started with these areas of focus. Now remember that this, not only it's optional, but we can work on this later, but this is going to come either as a string or an array of strings. So I think the best thing we do here is to test first if it is a string. Because if it is, this is really straightforward. We just have to output that string inside here. So let's do that. Let's create a test here that will check if student.majors, actually it's not the majors, but the type of the majors. So if the type is a string, then we are going to do something, and this is going to be super simple. We are just going to output the student.majors. Now look, TypeScript correcting my mistakes again. I just made a confusion here since I saw majors. I thought this was the name of the property, but it's not majors, but focus area. You may think that I'm doing this on purpose. Of course, sometimes I'm doing this on purpose, but this is something that happened to me a few times while developing real applications. So now if it is a string, we just do this. Else, then in this case, we know that this is an array. And if this is an array, then we're gonna need to loop through the array and form the string. So the first thing we can do here is to create a new string. We can call it areas. And this is going to start as an empty string. Then we can loop through this array, because if this is not a string, we know for sure that this is going to be an array. So we can do for each, and then for every area, we are going to call it area. And we are going to add it to this string. So areas will be equal to areas plus something. We know we can do that with the incremental operator, so plus equal, and then we are going to add the area. We also need to add a comma, because remember that these are going to be separated by comma. So at the end, we are going to add comma and space so we can add the other ones. Then at the end of the loop, so let me take this from here, when we finish the loop, we are going to append the string we have inside areas. So if we save this and we go back there, we can see that now this is working fine for the first student, but we have this comma at the end. We don't want to have a comma at the end. And this is simple to remove because remember that if we don't have an array, if we have a string, then we won't have any commas. We're going to run this code. If we have an array, even if we only have one element inside the array, we are going to finish with comma. So what we need to do is just remove the last two elements of the string, because this is always going to be comma space. So we can do this with the slice method. And if we do from 0 to -1, we are going to remove the last character, which is this one, but we need to remove the comma as well. So let's go until -2. And if we do this and go back there, we now remove the comma at the end, but we still have the ones in the middle. So this is pretty good. Now, there is one thing that I don't know if you noticed, but remember that this property is optional. We have the question mark right here, but TypeScript is not telling us that we are not taking that into consideration, because if it's not a string, then we are going to do this, meaning that if that's not present, we are also going to run this code. And of course, if we run a for each on an undefined value, this is going to cause a runtime error. So why isn't TypeScript telling us about that? Because remember that we need to set a flag if we want TypeScript to raise these errors. Let's go back to the documentation. Let's go to everyday types. Let's search for no. So here we have no and undefined. And let's remember that we need to turn on the strict no checks on. When we do that, whenever there's a possibility of values being null or undefined, we will need to test for those values before using methods or properties. So this is exactly what we need. We want TypeScript to raise that for us. So let's copy the name of the rule. Let's go back there and let's remember we need to go to the configuration file. Inside the compiler options, we are going to add that rule and we are going to set this to true. Once we do that and go back to the index, we can see that now it is highlighting this error. It is also highlighting one at the top here, but we're going to work on this one next. So for this one, now it's telling us that this is possibly undefined. And this is because we just told TypeScript that this is optional. If this wasn't optional, we would know for sure that either we have a string or an array. But as this one is optional, now we know that this might be a problem. But this is fine. We just have to do a test at the top here. So if we have student.focus area, then we are going to do everything we did inside here. And now as you can see, there's no error anymore, because if we don't have a focus area, we are not going to go inside here. So then we can just create an else if you want. This is not mandatory, and we could do something like this. We could form that cell with maybe a dash or 2 dashes. It's really up to you. So when the student doesn't have that property, we are just going to show 2 dashes. Now going to the top here, TypeScript is raising another error. Let's see what it is. It's telling us that this is possibly null. And for this one, there's nothing much we can do here regarding types, because we already told TypeScript that the table should be of type HTML table element, but the problem here is not the table. The problem here is this query selector, because when we run this, we cannot be 100% sure that we will find this inside the table. If there is a T-body, this is going to work fine, but what is there isn't a T-body? Well, in our case, we have no doubt that this will exist, because if we go to the HTML file, we can see that the T-body is already hard-coded right here. So there's no chance we don't find that T-body. Fortunately, in TypeScript, there is something that serves exactly for this case. If we go back to the documentation and we search for non-no, we can see that there is an operator called non-null assertion operator. We need to be a bit careful when using this, because when we use it, TypeScript is not going to raise problems regarding things being null or undefined. So we can only use this when we are 100% sure that this is not going to be the case. So as you can see, we add the exclamation mark right after the value. In this case, we can safely do this because we know for sure that this exists on the page. This is not going to be null. So right after the value, so here we have the query selector tBody. That's the part where we are having a problem. And we can let TypeScript know that this is not going to be null. We add the exclamation mark, and now we don't have the error anymore. So saving this, we have no errors. We go to the page. We can see that this is being rendered correctly. And here, it's always good to open the terminal just to see if the compiler is not showing any errors. Sometimes errors are not raised on the file, but we can see them in the terminal. So we can see that the compiler is running, there are no errors, and everything is working fine. So we are ready to move on to the last cell, which is the one for the status. So I'll see you then. Hey there, in this video we are going to work on the last cell that we're missing here, which is the registration status. And of course, after doing that, we need to run the loop because right now, as an example, we are just running that function on the first student. So let's work on this cell first. Going back to Visual Studio Code, this is right here. And remember that some students will have a date registration suspended. This one is going to be pretty simple. We just need to test if the student has this. If it has, we are going to output the status as inactive. If not, we are going to output it as active. So super simple. Let's go there and do that now. So here, let's just add a test. So let's see if this exists. If it exists, then we are going to output the inactive status. If not, we are going to print it as active. So then we can go back there. We can see that this one is active. But if we go back to the data, let's see one that doesn't have. So student with the index of 2. So this is 0, this is 1, this is 2. For this one, we will be able to test this. So let's go to the index.ts file. Let's change this to 2. Save this. Let's go back there and we can see that this is working fine. We can also see that the area of focus is working fine when the property is not present. So we are now ready to move on to the next video and run the loop through the students array. I'll see you then. Hey there, now that we were able to work on the function to add students to the table, we need to run a loop through the students array and run this function for every student. So what we could do here, we could just run the loop right here and add the row for every student. But I prefer to do this on a separate function because later on, if we want to add more features like adding filters, then we will have a function that will get a new list of students with the filters applied and generate the table again. So we will be able to reuse code. And not only that, not only for reuse purposes, but by adding a separate functions and defining the types for the parameters, we can use the help of TypeScript to see if our code is valid. So I'm going to create a function and I'm going to call it refresh table. Now to refresh the table, we need two things. We need to know which table we are talking about. So we can copy this declaration and also this one. This is going to be slightly different here. So first, we have a table, which is going to be an HTML table element, and we also need one for the list of students. And this is not going to be a student, but an array of students. So this is how we declare an array of student. Now inside here, we are going to get that table and we are going to do the query selector for getting the tBody. So we can copy this part of the code right here. And we are going to set the inner HTML to an empty string. This is why I'm calling this function refresh table, because if we already have students there, first we are going to clean them and then we are going to generate the roles again. We are having this error because, again, TypeScript knows that this might return no. If we don't find a t-body inside the table, this is going to return new. But again, since we know for sure that we have the t-body, this is hard-coded in the HTML, we can safely assert the non-new. So let's use the non-new assertion operator with the exclamation mark, and now we don't have the error anymore. Now we just need to run a loop through the students. So students dot for each. Inside here, for every student we find, we are going to run a function, and this function is going to be to add a row. So here we are going to pass the table, because this function needs to receive a table in order to add the roles, and we are going to pass a student. So as you can see, TypeScript is not raising any errors, so most likely this is going to work without any problems. Now here we just need to run this when the page loads. So we can add a function, window.onload, and here we are going to use the refresh table function. And as an argument, we are going to pass this HTML table. And we are also going to pass the list of students. So now we don't have any errors being raised because this one is indeed returning an HTML table element, which is what we need. This one is an array of students. So if everything is correct, we should be able to see the list of students. Let's save this. Don't forget to have the compiler running in the watch mode, so you have your JS file being generated on every save. And when we go back to the browser, we can see that everything's working perfectly. We don't have any errors in the console, so we are done with this project. So I hope you enjoyed doing this project. I decided to make it super simple so we don't have too many distractions. And I think it's also important to understand that this is how we use TypeScript. We use it incrementally. We identify places where TypeScript can help us write better code. And while doing this process, remember how many times I made a mistake with the names of the properties, and TypeScript helped me identifying those errors while I was typing the code. Now I'm just going to remove this console.log from here. And going back there, this project is now done. Now, after this, if you want to add more features, feel free to do that. For example, if you want to add a filter that will show only students that are active, this will be super simple to do because we now have this function to refresh the table. So you would just get the array of students, filter only the active students, and then you could generate the table again.